ร้อยแล้วนะครับคราวนี้ในยุคนี้ความสัมพันธ์ระหว่างสหรัฐอเมริกากับรัสเซียนั้นจะเป็นอย่างไรนะครับแน่นอนบทบาทของประธานาธิบดีรัสเซียวลาดิเมียร์ปูตินนั้นมีมากขึ้นเรื่อยๆในโลกนะครับไม่ใช่เฉพาะในตะวันออกกลางแต่ว่าในยุคใหม่นี้ซึ่งจะมีความสัมพันธ์พิเศษกับวอชิงตันนะครับวิเคราะห์สถานการณ์ของโลกของเราในวันนี้นะครับแขกรับเชิญของเราท่านเป็นอาจารย์ที่มหาวิทยาลัย City University of London นะครับวันนี้อยู่กับเราศาสตราจารย์ดรอนาสเตเชียเนสเวตไทโลวานะครับสวัสดีครับโอเค nice to see you okay you just flew from the UK
Yes, we flew from London.
Okay, thank you for joining us. Let's talk about this new era of what looks to be cordial relations. Let's start with this. Cordial relations between the United States and Russia. I mean, isn't this kind of a wonderful thing? How do you view this, first of all? Because Trump was just inaugurated, and he seems to be very much praising of Putin all the time. How do you view this relationship right now?
With skepticism, partly because it's very difficult to change policy very quickly. Even if you have a very strong vision and if you're a very strong leader. But if you're a leader in a system where lots of checks and balances, like in the US, Mr. Trump will find out that it's not really up to him to quickly change policy. He depends on others. And even his Republican-dominated Congress is very divided on the issue of Russia and warming up the climate or the new relationship and being friends. So political scientists or analysts like to call this type of relationship that the US and Russia have now established as a policy of containment. You don't really open up, you don't really engage actively, you contain something that is perceived as a threat or a possible threat. And the difference that Trump can bring into this new era or new twist is that this will be a friendly containment. Whereas Obama contained Russia through quite clear signals of, you're not being good enough, you have done this, and you're very, very corrupt, and we don't want to do business with you. Trump might not be saying this in such detail, although you would be surprised that he did call for Russian sanctions back in 2014, calling it quite a...
Before the election?
Before he decided to run for president. So he's on record actually seeing Russia very much along the mainstream of American foreign policy or politicians. So he could be a very friendly, but still a containing U.S. president.
For example, under President Obama, during the last month, he ordered the expelling of many Russian diplomats. Should I expect that President Trump will reverse that immediately? Is that something that is likely to come in the first couple of months?
To be honest, I don't know Mr. Trump personally, so I cannot say for sure that I know. I think broadly it will be much easier for Trump to reverse policies that were simply taken as a presidential decree by Obama, so basically at a stroke of a pen, rather than a law or a legislative act where he has to go to Congress. So if he decides to reverse this, he might well do that, but then as far as American politics is concerned, he would have to present to others some evidence that the expelled diplomats were not implicated or the threat is gone now and things have changed. Because usually in a democracy, in a system with some checks and accountability, you need to provide evidence for change or justification. And whatever he does, these justifications will be very needed.
The sense that I get from you is that we should not expect American foreign policies to change course immediately.
Absolutely.
Because it's not just about what the president is thinking.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now what about things like Syria? Because it seems as if Syria, during the campaign at least, the stance on the part of the U.S. president, the incoming U.S. president, is that he would kind of allow Russia to operate, allow Bashar al-Assad to be the government that he is, and that the U.S. would step aside, at least in that arena. I mean, are we looking at peaceful discussions between both the United States and Russia that could lead to some sort of a resolution of the conflict?
To be honest, I think US-Russia relationship is largely irrelevant to the Syrian conflict. The causality that you mentioned is actually the reverse. First, the US disengaged from the Middle East, and then Russia grabbed the opportunity, seized the opportunity, and stepped in with more proactive actions. And as a result, we're now seeing Russia and Turkey really holding the agenda, inviting others to join if they want. So to be honest, because of the much bigger systemic context of all this, it's helpful if there is more understanding between the two powers, between America and Russia. But the precise tone of the conversation is irrelevant to this conflict.
Because
it has outgrown that.
Because you're saying America is already disengaged from Syria.
Correct.
Okay.
So in some ways it was even beneficial to Obama that Russia was doing the dirty job.
Okay. So in this particular scenario, it might not have an effect on Syria.
Absolutely.
Okay. On Crimea. Okay. There's a lot of talk about this because America imposed sanctions against Russia, right? Because of the actions, the military actions in Crimea. A lot of talk as well that those sanctions will be lifted. You think that is likely to take place?
Difficult too, partly because the sanctions that current US has against Russia is actually at least 3 groups, and some of them are very historical. It's to do with nuclear deals that Russia is doing with other countries. And it precedes Crimea, Ukrainian conflict, and Obama. And it will be very impossible for a new president, be that Trump or anybody else, to actually do something about them. This is a very historical, entrenched policy. As to Crimea, Ukraine, there are 2 sets of sanctions. Something to do with personalized actions against people perceived to be very close to Putin. And it could be that possibly could be the easiest for Trump to revoke, again, if it simply involves a stroke of a pen. Other sanctions are in some way more significant for Russia because they're financial and diplomatic and technological. And here his hands are much more tied. Not only because, again, he needs to provide evidence that there is the circumstances on the ground have changed, but also importantly because he depends on Europe. He cannot act alone.
But from speaking to you, it's
Yes.
almost like you're not that excited about this new era of
I'm
Trump.
not excited at all.
It seems as if you think that things will not change much.
No.
What about on mutual cooperation on drilling oil in the Arctic? You know, lifting sanctions and then like ExxonMobil going in with Rosneft and having all the fun. You know, under a Trump-Putin era. I'm imagining all of this, but are you not thinking about that stuff happening?
I know a lot of people do, but it's usually the reality is much more complex.
It makes for really
it's true that
exciting news.
Exxon and Rosneft,
Yes.
exactly. Exxon and Rosneft did lose a lot of money when the sanctions were introduced and they couldn't go ahead with this very difficult project in the Arctic. But now that the price of oil is so low, there are actual rational economic questions over, do you need to do it? Would it be even profitable for you to do this massive investment, very expensive and hard exploration, to pile into the market that doesn't seem to be moving very much? It made a lot of sense when oil was projected at $150, $200 per barrel, but now it fluctuates at 50. This is not particularly exciting prospect for any oil company. That's one economic reason. Another reason is political. You don't need sanctions to be lifted to do cooperation. Financial system is quite complex. It's very intricate. It works through various jurisdictions, and the recent privatization deal with Rosneft demonstrated that an Italian bank could be part of the privatization of Rosneft through an offshore entity in Singapore.
Okay, all right. So it might be able to be done without taking away sanctions.
Exactly.
Okay.
If somebody really thinks hard.
So
how to
are
do
you
it.
almost saying that just the excitement over the Trump-Putin relationship is just great news coverage, but not a lot of substance to it?
I would say that. I think both are great TV personalities, with Trump in particular being TV candy.
Yeah.
Whatever he does seems to be made into a movie.
Yeah.
But they are also very different, I think, characters. Trump is a property developer.
Yeah.
with an interesting business career. Some of it is, not very fortunate. Some of it is more successful. Putin is before he was president, he was head of the country's KGB, essentially FSB. He is a very seasoned politician. He understands the idea of governance, tactics versus strategy, relationships with others, what is it to deal with various agencies and institutions. And unlike Trump, he has great respect for security services, for the ideas of national interest, how to work with all these service people who are part of your apparatus. Trump so far has managed to upset a lot of security agencies that seem to safeguard American power and safety. So that already they are in some way not on equal even footing as politicians.
If I were a Russian, living in Russia, should I look forward to a Trump presidency because he will threaten to, break up NATO? He keeps tweeting that NATO is obsolete, right, and saying all these negative things about NATO, and then saying bad things about the European Union as well. I mean, he says positive things about London and the UK, but he just bashes the EU on a daily basis. If I were Russia, looking at a geostrategic point of view, isn't this a good thing that you have a U.S. president that has this point of view from a Russian perspective?
Well, Russian perspective can still be very different. There are more than 120 million people living in Russia. And even inside the government, there are various factions.
Almost like from a traditional Cold War, perspective.
Okay, from a traditional Cold War perspective, it's not clear that a breakup of NATO would be in Russian interest.
Oh.
Partly because Cold War was fought on the very kind of widely understood principles. Containment was one of them, but also non-interference. There were lots of threats. There was lots of methodologies of penetration, spying, but it was a very it was a turf conflict with very understood, predictable logic. A breakup of NATO would be a massively disruptive event that would, destabilize lots of things, and unpredictability is something that, for example, President Putin doesn't like at all.
So that might not even work in Russia's interests.
No, not necessarily.
In the easy way that people mean.
The expansion of NATO has been made into a security doctrine of Russia, but I see it as more of a rhetoric rather than an actual threat.
All right.
And just to give you one example, the military choir that sadly crashed into the Black Sea with the air crash just before New Year's Eve, a week before that tragic event, they were given a concert in NATO headquarters. So there've always been some sort of cooperation at more professional level or more cultural. There is a level of mutual respect between the two organizations, the army, the Russian army and NATO. And even Putin himself, early on in 2003, mentioned that Russia might want to become member of NATO. All
right. So it's a lot of rhetoric, but the details are what is important. Okay.
I always believe that.
All right. We'll take a short break. เดี๋ยวเราพักกันสักครู่นะครับกลับมาคุยกันช่วงหน้ากับอาจารย์แอนาสเตเชียกันต่อเรื่องของทรัมป์ปูตินรัสเซียนะครับประชาธิปไตยในรัสเซียเป็นยังไงนะครับสักครู่เดี๋ยวกลับมาคุยกลับมาในรายการ Big Dose นะครับวันนี้คุยเรื่องรัสเซียนะครับกับอาจารย์แอนาสเตเชียเนสเวตไทโลวา is Russia's democracy now kind of like just standing still? I think it's as bad as many academics, portray it. I mean, it seems like
things are not as black and white as a lot of academics portray, and things are usually not very linear. So the idea of democracy and various types of democracy is being tested usually against one type of a non-democracy regime. But if you start to look at various gradations, academic concepts that have been used to describe Russia, I think I've counted up to 10. It ranges from mafia state to modern state, from authoritarian state to competitive authoritarianism to sovereign democracy. So a lot of it is very theoretical. The simplest way to describe the system of power, a lot of which depends on very unseen mechanisms, on mechanisms that that outsiders are not supposed to understand, but they work. It's the rule by law, but it's not a rule of law. So that means that in real life there are various institutions that normal modern democracies have: parliament, constitution, Supreme Court, the court system, the legal system, the presidential administration, the president's security. There are various checks and balances that in some ways do work, even in certain circumstances they're made to work. But at the same time, there is an expectation that certain elements of that system are above any scrutiny or accountability. To an average Russian, this seems to be an acceptable compromise. They have had their experiment with liberal democracy, what they thought was democracy, in the 90s. And it was a very condensed dose of changes that made them feel poorer and less happy and more inferior in the world.
So the current compromise is acceptable?
The current compromise is that essentially, yes, your average Russian would understand that it's an extremely corrupt system where there are a lot of rich guys and possibly a lot of poor. But it seems to be the only alternative that Russia at the moment has.
I listened to an interview on Charlie Rose on CBS in America by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and he was asked the question whether the removal of Vladimir Putin would make Russia democratic. His answer kind of surprised me. He said that Vladimir Putin is like the stabilizing mechanism, meaning that if you take him away, there would be a lot of instability in the Russian state, meaning that there are a lot of power factions and institutions. I mean, do you view it in that way?
Correct, and that's one, I absolutely agree, and that's one characterization of essentially Russian capitalism. It's now made up of, let's say, at least three big factions. One is the early oligarchs of the 90s, who are now aging and maybe passing some of their wealth to their children, the business tycoons. The other is the people who came with Putin or along with his time from security, essentially security apparatus, and became very rich. At the same time, they also have usually official posts, political positions. Some of them are elected. And there is sort of elements of liberal elite, the economists, usually on the economic flank of the government, who are supposed to implement programs, distribute money, govern investment, be in charge of people getting better off. And so there is an understanding that Putin is an important arbiter between these various functions, the three of them, but also within them, because of course as the economic crisis worsens, the resources become thinner and thinner. So competition for that kind of administrative resource or the opportunity for rent-seeking is getting very tight. And a lot of social media information leaks are being used by the warring factions to eliminate competitor.
But do you think it's worthwhile seeking a functioning multi-party system in Russia down the road that may threaten the stability that we have right now? Or do you think the status quo is better? Because, you know, in many countries they just struggle. They struggle through this. They have multi-party democracies and it looked pretty good. But then there's no real stability. Governments don't last. Nothing gets done. Whereas Russia kind of works now from the outside, but it's got its failings, you know, in particular aspects. Do you think it's worthwhile seeking a multi-party system, or is it too difficult in Russia?
First of all, there is a multi-party system. There are several parties represented in parliament. There are several big ones, and one of them is closely associated with Putin, the current prime minister, but there are also others who represent the approved opposition. So some of the legislative proposals or even opposition in parliament can be quite critical at an acceptable level. At the same time, I have to say that the most ardent proponent of anti-corruption stance, Navalny, is not allowed, wasn't allowed to be competing for his particular seat. His party didn't get the necessary 5% of the votes. Historians would tell you that Russia doesn't have a historical fabric to be a multi-party democracy. There are too many important institutions in Russian life which prioritize a very autocratic mode of governance. That includes the family, the church, local and regional kind of Soviets, the councils, the territory. Russia is too large to be a multi-party democracy. It needs to have a very strong leader who would be the systemic oversight. This is the so-called Slavophile argument, and it's an argument against against the idea that you can simply build capitalism from scratch and democracy will follow because this is the blueprint. This is exactly what they tried to do in the 90s, and
it didn't work. Yeah.
It didn't really work. Some of the elements were installed, but it didn't really work.
Okay, but this argument it sounds similar to many of the arguments that I hear actually in many developing countries.
Yes.
Where they're trying to create democracy, including Thailand. Last question. What can we expect from the new U.S. Secretary of State? I mean, he is a friend of Russia. He's got a medal for it. He worked for Exxon. Should that be a positive for Russia? Do you have a friend of Russia as U.S. Secretary of State? That's kind of a good thing. I'm looking at this as very pro-Russian Washington. I'll let you comment on that as we.
I don't know. This is pure speculation because I don't have any intelligence at all. But it could be a very good news for his friends who are not on the sanctions list, for example, not on Magnitsky sanctions list. But he might soon be a businessman. Again, his learning curve in politics will be very steep. He will very quickly have to understand that foreign policy of a major country doesn't depend on personalities necessarily. Yeah. It's about compromise, it's about looking for alternatives, and it's about you being accountable to your domestic institutions. So he would find it very difficult again for a massive change in foreign policy in a very short time, partly because of current security considerations.
It's not like running a company, making deals.
Exactly.
Okay. Funnily, I just listened to an interview on NBC News with the Kremlin spokesperson.
Yes.
And he sounded like that. He was kind of skeptical of this administration. He was not buying into the fact that this is going to be a pro-Russia Washington, all convenient. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Anastasia, and I look forward to talking to you again. There's a lot of comparative politics to be done between the Russian Federation and Thailand. Certainly in the way that you explained to me that pro-Slavic Russophile. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
นั่นก็คือบทสนทนาของเรานะครับกับอาจารย์แอนนาสเตเชียนะครับมาจาก City University of London นะครับเรื่องรัสเซียเรื่องทรัมป์เรื่องปูตินนะครับลาไปก่อนนะครับวันนี้สำหรับ Big Dose สวัสดีครับ